introduce Sharon. Sharon Woods has a lot of acronyms after her name that I won't go into. She is the owner of LandUseUSA Urban Strategies, and she is from Lansing, Michigan. Sharon provides a modern approach to urban market strategies and target market analysis. She conducts specialized studies of migrating households and lifestyle preferences for missing building formats across all land use categories, including housing, retail, and complementary categories like overnight accommodations, entertainment, dining, and recreation. Sharon's housing studies focus on the lifestyle preferences of migrating households seeking missing housing formats in small and large urban places. She also studies retail gaps and opportunities for filling traditional merchant space in downtowns and along urban corridors. Sharon has also trademarked a unique place score methodology used to track placemaking progress in urban and downtown settings. Sharon is a certified counselor of real estate, which makes her specifically qualified or especially qualified to consult developers on site-specific projects and opportunities. She serves on the board of directors for the Michigan chapter of the Congress for the New Urbanism, which is happening next week, is a faculty member with the Incremental Development Alliance, which we are bringing to Maine in the fall, and also serves on the Form-Based Codes Institute's Resource Council. And last but not least, her firm is 100% women-owned with the DBE certification in several states. So I will pass this presentation to Sharon. Thank you everyone for joining. And if you're just joining now, just a quick note on Zoom, we're gonna mute you, but feel free to unmute yourself during the question and answers portion. If you have any troubles, please chat me directly. And there was one last thing. I can't remember. Okay, thanks, Sharon.
Awesome, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Mandy, can you hear me? Okay, great. Just want to make sure my audio is working. Thank you, Mandy, and to Kara and to the Build Maine organization for inviting me to talk with you today about this target market analysis. I have about 40 slides and about 40 minutes, and then we are going to save time, hopefully, for Q&A, because I really do want to hear your questions and maybe have a little bit of a dialogue. So real quickly, if you have any desire to reach out to me individually, there's my email address and my cell phone. You can call or shoot me a message anytime or a text, and we can chat. So to dive in, I want to real quickly talk about the conventional approach to doing a housing study, which is the typical supply-demand analysis. And let's see, just muting the gallery there so I can see my own slides. So when we think about supply and demand, typically it's a study of established households already living in a community and comparing that with built housing units that are already built in that same community by tenure and price. So that's the conventional approach. It's also the HUD model when we think about doing affordable housing studies, or if you do analyses to impediments to affordable housing, those conventional types of studies. And they're very much focused again on identifying the mismatch between incomes and values and rents. And it's kind of myopic in that way, and it ends up really kind of assuming that owners are in houses because that's what they want, renters are in apartments, that's what they can usually afford, or even want because they want to be mobile, and that this is okay. We just need to figure out if there's a mismatch in the rents. So for example, this is a study that I did recently, just looking at renter income brackets and even identifying where the extremely low, very low, low, and market rate breaks are for that community based on HUD's low to moderate income standards. So if you're familiar with working with 50 or 30 or 80% of AMI, it's that kind of a study. And I try to line up the renter income brackets if you really focus on the high end here and the low end, and then try to match that up with the rents. And if we see that there's you know, 24%, 12% that can afford high-end prices, but there really isn't a supply there, then we might argue that there's a mismatch. And similarly, on the low end of the bracket, where we see that, you know, 23% of the households are earning less than 20K, then we would expect to have a supply that matches that, and we're seeing a bit of a mismatch. So that's just kind of getting us grounded in some of the conventional approaches here. Other things that we do in a supply-demand study is just look at what's currently available in the market. So gathering information about each apartment building or complex or rental unit, and gathering information on how much square footage is there, what's the rent, and then calculating the rent per square foot, and recognizing that there's a relationship between the rent per square foot and the unit size. It usually looks like this, kind of a ski slope, where small units usually have a higher rent per square foot, and lower units have a lower rent per square foot. And the economies of this kind of a scatter plot or relationship can be leveraged by developers. We spend some time in IncDev and in my firm working with developers to help them understand that supersizing the units isn't necessarily going to help their bottom line, that it may actually be the smaller units that are most profitable. Other things that we can do, looking at, you know, building permits. So this chart just shows single-family building permits in gray and multifamily attached building permits in blue. And of course, we went through that recession and plummet during the housing crisis back during the Great Recession, and we saw it plummet. And we started to see single-family homes tick back up while attached units were really staying flat. So just another way of looking at supply and demand. The challenge with that approach is that it very much assumes that, again, that your existing households are finding the formats that they would want and prefer, and that the developers are building what the residents, what your households want. And so what it really misses is, I think it will be clear a little more clear when I jump to this next slide. It misses the fact that there are households who are migrating, on the move. They have lifestyle preferences that might not match up with the formats of the existing units that you have in your city or town or community. So it's not a price mismatch necessarily as much as a focus on the mismatch in building formats. And I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation really focusing on elaborating on that, and hopefully you'll find some of the information and the data interesting. All the other slides I just grabbed from some studies that I had done in Michigan. The remainder of the slides are going to focus on 3 communities. We're going to look at Portland and Lewiston and Thompson, and I'll provide some data for those 3 places. So most of you being entrenched in CNU, you've probably seen this kind of image, the missing middle housing diagram. Most of us are familiar with that kind of document. There are a couple buildings here just to kind of, again, get us grounded into what we mean. They may be lofts above Main Street retail. They may be townhouses or row houses transitioning into the neighborhoods. They may be townhouses, again, urban lofts, brownstones, you know, a variety of things like that. So to dive into the data a little bit for you, the first thing to acknowledge is that renters have much higher movership rates than owners. And this is an important part of doing a target market analysis, is just really understanding who's on the move, who wants to move into and within these communities, and what are they looking for. So the first thing is understanding that on average, about 30% of all renters move every year. And that's much higher than owners, which is about 6%. And you can see the differences here for Portland is really has higher movership rate, and that's partly attributed to its size and urbanicity and the fact that renters tend to gravitate towards larger urban places. But I want to clarify that these types of studies can be done in small and medium and large urban places of all sizes. And so real quickly, I have another slide in here where I think I define what an urban place is in this type of an analysis. The other thing to highlight here is that lower income households are also on the move, more so than upper income households. And so you could imagine that these variables are correlated. Renters tend to be lower income, and if they're more inclined to move, then lower income households are probably more inclined to move as well. But it's interesting to see the data really fall off. What happens is that as your household becomes more affluent, you're more inclined to be a homeowner. Homeowners tend to be very settled. So once you buy a home, if you're in a mortgage, you're probably more inclined to be in a detached house, and you're far less inclined to make a move. And to show the data one other way, which is with the age profiles. So children tend to be settled in with their maturing parents, and parents seem disinclined. You know, we don't want to move our kids from one school to another, so they tend to be a little more settled. But once we leave our parents' home and we start looking for a place to live of our own, the younger populations definitely have a higher movership rate. And there are lifestyle preferences that are driving this. It's not just income and searching for a job, but also a growing desire among our younger populations to be footloose and free, to be able to adapt and be able to be resilient. And when we think about things like COVID-19 that's hitting us and has been hitting us, these younger populations will be the trend setters, what I call trend setters, in how they respond to economic crises like this. And these are the groups that we're watching very closely to see what their locational preferences are as we recover from this economic crisis. So again, what is an urban place? This is my slide that I found here. When I do target market analyses, we do studies for communities of all sizes, cities and towns. In Michigan, we have villages. And I'm usually looking for some sort of a downtown, even if it's just one or two historic buildings, hopefully with 2 levels. I've worked in downtowns or for communities that have a downtown with just one building that is 2 levels and has some historic character. We're looking for a traditional street grid, some sense of compactness in the rooftops, and some sort of sense of place, even if it's a town square or it may be a small amenity, but a sense of place somewhere in the downtown. And that helps us define an urban place. And then, of course, most of us are familiar with this urban transect, just imagining that we're working within, oops, I'm going to try to go back to that slide. I'm going to move my screen sharing so I can see my slides there. So another important piece of this target market analysis approach is studying the lifestyle preferences of these households that are on the move. And some of you may be familiar with data sets like PRISM data that might be used by Claritas, and there's a few other sources out there. I subscribe to Experian Decision Analytics Experian data, and they provide me with 71 different lifestyle clusters across the nation. I know that you can't read the labels. This grid is just showing you what 71 looks like in terms of, you know, just the mosaic, if we think about it as a mosaic of households and lifestyle preferences. And we can actually sort them based on whether they're rural, they're inclined to live in a rural place or an urban place. I can sort them many other ways based on income, inclination to be a renter versus a homeowner, inclination to choose a detached versus an attached unit, inclination to move in any given year, so 30% moving, 5% moving. And then there's so much, there's really 20 pages of data behind each of these lifestyle clusters as well. And some of the more urbanites down here are, if you can kind of hear me read them out loud with and follow with me, imagine that these are the urbanites and how they might fit within the lifestyle cluster and mosaic. So A6 here is jet set urbanites, and they're very affluent. In fact, they rank 6 among the list in terms of affluence. Urban edge, they're ranking 25 in the list among 70, so about only a third of the way down. And again, number 1 is the most affluent, and number 71 is the poorest of the poor. So urban edge is 25. And I have a few others here. Striving single scene. They're a very important group. They're at 54. And then Metro Fusion. And then at the lowest end, the poorest of the poor are the tough times, and they're sitting right here, number 71. Here's 69, the urban survivors. So it's very diverse. We have everything from urban survivors and tough times to jet set urbanites. So very diverse, and it kind of hopefully breaks down this notion that everything that we build needs to be for low-income households, or that every attached for-lease unit is going to be occupied by a low-income household. We absolutely need to meet that need and take care of and help those households find good quality housing. But in our urban places, in our downtowns, we should also be providing a diversity, a mix of market rate as well. And my slide is not scrolling. I'm not sure why it froze up. So let me try again here. There we go. So I think that if I don't scroll, it maybe locks up. So again, some of these lifestyle clusters include diverse singles and singles of all ages. So it's no longer that just our young folks are the singles, but that we have singles of all ages for many different reasons. And in fact, single person, I should say unmarried head of householders now are the majority in the nation. So they're gaining about 1% a year. And they're probably right now at about 53% or so of all households. So 53% of households have a head of householder that's unmarried or single. And they may or may not have children. So again, they're very diverse, but also recognizing we still have traditional families and they also have needs, and they're very important and diverse. So I often get this question, how does Experian collect the data? And of course, socioeconomic data from the American Community Survey, tracking life events. One really important piece is that they're tracking how we spend money and how we use money and the tools that we use to make purchases. So everything from retail spending to how we manage credit and debt and our mortgage and leasing activity. This data can be gathered at a block group level and then packaged and sold to consultants like myself. But of course, they cannot sell individual householder names or addresses, but the data is quite powerful. If you imagine, most of us have a credit card in our wallet, and most of us, our data is being gathered. So again, to talk more about the state of Maine and these 3 communities, Portland, Lewiston, and Topsom. And just to get us geographically grounded, you can see that they're actually not real close, but they're clustered toward the southern end of the state. So here we have Portland. Lewiston is across from Auburn. Topsom is across from Brunswick. And again, just some geographical grounding here. And so I ran, before I dive into this data, this is providing a summary of what we call the annual market potential based on in-migration into each of the communities. This slide focuses on Portland, and you can see that on the upper right-hand part of the title is the community name, the city of Portland. And so what I've done is just calculated how many households are migrating into Portland each year. It's that simple. It's just the number of households migrating into the city. And I can compare them based on the lifestyle cluster data, which is behind all of this. I've rolled it all up and figured out who's moving into the city, what are their lifestyle clusters, and then I rolled it all up and figured out how many of them are renters and how many are owners. So the way to read this is each year, 5,420 households move into Portland every year. Of them, 4,915 are renters and only 325 are owners. This is not adjusted for out-migration. I work in so many communities that are currently experiencing net population loss or net population or net household loss. So if I tried to take out the out-migration, I might actually have a negative number or a very, very tiny number. And then I'm not able to really study the characteristics and lifestyle preferences of these households. So I actually want to just study the households that are moving into the city and figure out what they look like, who they are, and what are they looking for. The other thing that's interesting, here's the same 5,420 households, but now I've broken them down by their inclination to either choose an attached unit or a detached unit. So although 4,900 plus are renters, only 3,950 would be inclined to choose an attached unit. And although only 325 are owners, there's actually an inclination of these households that are migrating to look for 1,470 detached units. This means that renters are on the move looking to rent a detached house. And it means that usually we see this in many communities where we have, I wouldn't necessarily call it a surplus of houses, but to really recognize that this is a nationwide trend, that renters are looking to rent detached houses, and that we don't, again, breaking down that paradigm that all renters want an attached unit. It's not quite that simple. So I showed you Portland there, and I'm going to try to scroll and pause and show you Lewiston. The scale has changed. Lewiston is about half as large, so I changed the scale. But we have something similar where we have 2,000 households moving into Lewiston, and again, the majority are renters. But what's interesting here in Lewiston is that only half of these combined households would look for an attached unit. They're even more inclined than ever to look to rent a detached house. And one more is Topsom, with 115 renters moving into the town each year and 35 owners. And again, really more than half of those renters are actually looking for houses. There is a little bit of a catch-22 that happens. It's, you know, which comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of concept, that we could argue that if we perhaps built more attached units, we might actually be able to convert some of those renters into the attached units and make sure that we're providing more detached units that are attractive to owners and helping attract owners. So there's lots of ways to play with this data. There's lots of ways to argue that if we don't have what they're looking for, we may not be attracting them at all. So we have to be careful that we're not assuming that this is exactly what they're going to want going forward. And that's why I dive deeper into the data. So again, I'm going to start with Portland, and then I'll talk about Lewiston, and then Topsom. These are the lifestyle clusters or target markets that are actually looking to rent a new unit in the city of Portland based on last year's data. And we can kind of generally argue that this is what's probably likely to happen. Maybe not this year, will look very different, but next year and subsequent years. So this is what it looks like currently, is we have that 4,915 new renter households, brand new renters moving into the city of Portland each year. And I would like to highlight here that the striving singles are the largest group, and they're highlighted in dark blue. Now, I also am showing the digital dependents in dark blue because they are migrating to Topsom. The digital dependents are the dominant group, the most prevalent group migrating into Topsom. And I'll show you that in just a minute. But what I'm highlighting here is that striving singles are moving to Portland. Only 137 of the digital dependents are moving to Portland. And then daring to dream. This lifestyle cluster is the one that's most likely, or the largest group, I should say, the largest group that's moving to Lewiston. And only 6 are going to Portland. So let's watch those blue bars because they're very important. Striving singles in Portland. And there they are. This is a map just showing how they lay out visually. And then here are the daring to dream in Lewiston. And the digital dependents are there as well, and the striving singles, but in much smaller numbers. And I realize this may be jumping a little bit just because of Zoom's glitchiness, but again, striving singles in Portland and daring to dream in Lewiston. And I'm going to show you the daring to dream. There's the map by block group. And then here's Topsom. Digital dependents are the largest group. Of course, collectively, it's a much smaller migration into a smaller place, but the digital dependents are taking the largest share. But we still have 1 striving single and 1 daring to dream looking or inclined to rent a unit in Topsom. So you can compare those charts and really begin to understand what's going on in each local market. So again, for each of these target markets, they're now target markets. I had 71 lifestyle clusters, but I'm now recognizing that Portland, the southernmost one, so it's down here, Portland is doing a really good job of attracting striving singles. And 96% of them are renters. That's all that pie chart shows. And then Lewiston, the northwesternmost one, so it's up here, 98% are renters. And then over the northeasternmost one, 38% are renters. So the digital dependents are far more likely to be an owner. And Topsom is doing a good job of attracting them in general, not only as owners, but also as renters. We can look at a little more data here. This is the share of the renters that are moving. And again, Portland, among all of Portland's renters migrating into the city, 84% of those renters move every year. That is massive. That is really such an exceptionally high, the striving singles. 84% of the striving singles moving into Portland move every year. And again, that's just exceptionally high. Recognizing that on average, all renters, 30% move every year. The striving singles are twice as inclined to move every year. And then in Lewiston, the daring to dream, they also have exceptionally high movership rates. More than half move every year. And also the digital dependents, 68% move every year. So the sheer fact that these lifestyle clusters are very mobile and they're very transient and they're very inclined to pick up and move and change from one community to another and one address to another is an important part of an important variable of what drives that total market potential and contributes to the fact that there's such an important target market for each of these communities. The other thing to imagine is that if I know that digital dependents are moving to Topsom, I might be in Lewiston wondering why I'm not quite getting what seems to be my share. So it's also valuable as a community like Lewiston to really study your neighbors. And we do this, we always do this, is to figure out which lifestyle clusters are going to the communities around that town or city, and why are they bypassing Topsom or Lewiston? Why are the striving singles so inclined to go to Portland? And some of them are going to Lewiston and some are going to Topsom, but why? But not at the same level. And to try to understand, is there perhaps an upside opportunity, what I call kind of a boost, an opportunity to build product that the striving singles really want and are looking for, and making sure that we're providing that product and perhaps even intercepting or diverting some of those migrating households, intercepting them and attracting them to other communities.
Sharon,
So
just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Could you define, I think a lot of the questions that are happening right now in the chat are around the definitions of striving singles and digital dependence. Could you just quickly go over those 3 subcategories?
Absolutely. So it helps to look at the code, first of all, is that the striving singles are 54th in place out of 71. So you can kind of get a sense of where they fall on income, with 1 being the highest income. And digital dependents are at 51, and daring to dream is at 66. So the striving singles, these are young singles that are early in their careers, and many of them do have college degrees, but again, they're just very early in their careers, and they're focused on that career. So they are aspiring, and they may be a little bit below market rate or right about at market rate, but they're good tenants because their income will grow, and as their income grows, their ability to pay rents can also grow. So they are very valuable, and I will say the striving singles are the target market that if you have developers trying to build new lofts in your downtown or urban lofts on the edges of your downtowns, they're really competing for this group. This group is, again, market rate rents, very transient yet career driven, and they're very good tenants. On the daring to dream, these are struggling households, but aspiring also. So they're very inclined to move as soon as they can improve their quality of life or find a better job or get their children into a better school. They will make that move, and they are also aspiring. They may be low income, but they have certainly not given up, and they are doing everything they can to improve their quality of life. So providing moderately sized units that are, of quality, and making sure that they're proximate to amenities that these households some of them may be getting by without a car. So making sure that they're close to things like public transient, close to the schools, walkable to the downtown, very important. The digital dependents, again, I think I showed you earlier that only 1/3 of them are really renters, and 2/3 are more inclined to buy a house. They are maturing singles and couples, so they're not necessarily just singles. They are inclined to want to live in a detached house, even if they're renting. But they do like to be on the edges of the urban setting or the edges of the downtown. They do like walkable places. The digital dependents, if you're driving around your downtown and you have to slam on your brakes because a young adult is walking across the street talking on their phone, not looking at the traffic, that's the digital dependents. They have their phone with them 24/7. As soon as the newest model on a phone comes out, they will pinch their pennies if necessary to buy the newest, trendiest handheld devices. So this is market rate, below market, probably 50% of AMI. So I'm going to show you a little bit more. The last thing I want to show you on the data on these lifestyle clusters, again, the 3 that are most prevalent within Portland, Lewiston, and Topsom, is also the pie chart here shows their inclination to choose to live in a large or small or more rural community. So the striving singles are gravitating towards the larger city of Portland. And in fact, 70% of them would be inclined to choose a larger city. When they do move into Portland, these are nationwide averages, only 1% will look for a house. Only 2% would look for a duplex. And in fact, 50% of them, half of them, would be inclined to look for a low-rise or a mid-rise or a larger building. So again, if you have developers building urban lofts, they are absolutely going after this target market, very important. And let's watch the screen change now. Watch those, keep your eye on those bars and on this blue 70% as we go to Lewiston. And this is the Daring to Dream lifestyle cluster. More than half, again, would go to a large city, but we're doing a better job of bringing them to Lewiston, which might be more of a mid-sized city. And now 60% of them would choose a house. And only 40% would choose an attached unit. So this is interesting. It's almost a close match that, well, I forget what percent were renters. I would say a lot of these, most of these renters are going to look for attached units. I'm messing this up with the other group, which is the digital dependents. So I may need to clarify that later. Most are actually looking for houses. And I would say, let me say it another way, I think that half of these households that are looking for houses are probably looking to rent. Here are the digital dependents, and they're far more likely to choose a small or mid or small town, in the case of Topsom, or city. And 35% would be, only 35% would choose a larger place like Portland. And when they do move, 90% will choose a house. So again, there's a little bit of what comes first. If Topsom is mostly detached houses, then it may do an exceptionally good job of appealing to digital dependents. If Topsom does not have any attached units available for rent or is disinclined to offer that kind of product, then it also will be disinclined, far less likely to be able to attract striving singles and other diverse target markets that are on the move. So it becomes a challenge of, let's make sure that we're really thinking across the full spectrum of missing middle housing types and try to determine at a community level for each town, for each city, what are really your goals and objectives? And if you are interested in offering more product like this, then you may have opportunities to attract other households that are on the move. Or if you want to attract more diverse households, we may have to then make sure that we're providing the choices that they want. Let's not assume that just because they're not here already, that they wouldn't be. Perhaps if we built what they're looking for, we would do a much better job of attracting them. So another thing we can do is take the market potential. Oops, it's jumping around a little bit. I apologize for the jumping, everybody. But this is actually Portland data. I mislabeled it, and I apologize for that as well. So just scratch that out. This is Portland. And what we can do is take the market potential based on those lifestyle preferences, based on these charts. If I know striving singles, 50% are looking for, attached units or more, I can start to line up those migrating households with different building formats and just making sure that we're thinking not just about the market potential in terms of tenure, but that we're also thinking about it in terms of building format. I think my slide went to auto rotate on me, but you get the idea. Again, I'm using Opticos's images here to just kind of demonstrate how the market potential can be allocated to building format based on those lifestyle preferences. The last question, I'm really down to my last few slides here, I believe, is that we can start to do a mismatch test as well. If we know that 65% of our households that are on the move in the state of Maine, in this case, 65% are inclined to choose a house when they move, but 85%, if not more, probably perhaps even 90%, 85 to 90% of the supply is detached houses, then we may possibly have a mismatch. It becomes more clear when we look at the attached units, everything from duplexes to larger buildings. 35% of the households migrating in Maine right now are looking for attached alternatives to houses. but only 15% of the supply of the existing housing stock actually is attached. So that suggests a mismatch. That would suggest that, and I'm seeing this really across the nation, everyone, it's really applicable to every state and almost every community, is that we really have a undersupply and an absence, not enough attached units that are modern in particular or rehabbed to meet the expectations, the wants and needs of migrating households that are on the move. So I'm coming up on real quickly on our time for Q&A, and I appreciate your patience with me while I went through all of those slides. There are a couple of additional reading resources here if you're interested, how urban places can adapt after COVID. A story about Michigan's missing housing, just kind of here's the scoop. If you're interested in reading about the retail apocalypse, I wrote an article on that, debunking the myths with, again, this article is very heavy with data demonstrating that the death of retail is not in fact reality, and we're just trying to debunk the myth that's being propelled by mainstream media. You can explore these lifestyle clusters going into Experian. So they have a consumer segmentation portal. You do have to ask for a password and then wait 1 day in order to get a password in order to get into the segmentation data. But I really encourage you to do it because it's very rich data. I think you'll find it very interesting and it's worth the wait. So that's my wrap, and I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and so that we can open up chat and maybe have a dialogue. And you can have a narrative with each other. You don't have to just talk to me, whatever you like. Kara? Mandy?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can start off with one question that I think I saw a few people getting at in the chat, but can you just describe a little bit more in detail or explain when you're showing the data and where people are going, is that based on data coming from national research on those various groups, or is that based on what you're seeing actually happening in Maine in terms of what they're choosing?
So these are not national, right? So it's not based on nationwide trends. It is absolutely local data. So what I did is I'm able to go into Experian's data and actually delineate a polygon. And I draw a polygon around Lewiston. I can actually pull the city of Portland, for example, or the town of Topsom, and actually extract the data and see what lifestyle clusters actually live there. And since I know what their movership rate is, I know what % of them move each year, and I know their inclination to be a renter versus an owner, and their inclination to choose different building sizes. So all of that data is, I extract it for that local level polygon, I build it into a model, I analyze it, and I figure out, I roll up the data, I actually do the analysis for all 71 lifestyle clusters, and then I roll it up to figure out what the market potential is by tenure. And the one thing that I didn't show you is that we can also translate those building formats to unit sizes and to values and rents. So we know what the median household income is of each lifestyle cluster, and we know what the profile is. So we can deduce from that, if we assume that they spend 30 or 35% of their income on rent, we can back into a rent tolerance. And we can dial it into 30% if we're doing an affordable housing study, a little higher if we just want to understand, what is their tolerance. We can also take the data and back into the unit size. So we can say, well, if their income is $35,000 and they can afford, or they're inclined to tolerate rents of $850, then we can look at market conditions, local market conditions, and determine what the appropriate unit size would be in that local market for $850 a month. So we can back into the unit size. That also translates into building format as well. So if you imagine the tough times, 71, looking to find a place to rent for $350 a month, this is definitely an individual who's really struggling. And it may be appropriate to think about things like accessory dwelling units, for example, or studios or efficiencies or other formats like that, and making sure that their needs are met. Sorry for the long answer. I'll stop and let you go to another question.
Great. Actually, before we go to another question, I just wanted to give a plug for next week, and we're going to post our sponsors right now. So next week we have Chris Hawley and Bernice Radel. Chris is the planner for the city of Buffalo and will be sharing his experiences updating his community's zoning code and what it has meant to his city. Bernice is the owner of Buffalo Development and Little Wheel Restoration Company, and will share her experience working under Buffalo's new form-based code and how it has made small-scale projects more feasible and easier to execute. So I'll post the Build Maine tickets in case you have anybody that should be hearing that conversation and you want them to buy a ticket to Build Maine. And just a quick note that video and presentations materials are available for folks that have a ticket. So that's all of you, and they'll be emailed to you within the next week. Okay, back to the questions.
Great. Just to follow up on that, so you mentioned that those group have inclinations or, tend to make certain kinds of decisions. Is that based on data coming out of those groups?
Yes, so nationwide, so the data that we have is it's about 20 pages of behavior data for each lifestyle cluster, and it is based on national averages. So what Experian is able to do is just gather the behavior data of every household across the nation based on our credit behavior and so much more, and basically put us into buckets, 71 different buckets with behavioral attributes, and then analyze that, the collective group of all the households in that bucket, reanalyze it and figure out what is their movership rate, their inclination to be a renter versus owner. So yes, the behavior data is based on nationwide averages, whereas the migration data into these communities is based on polygons drawn around the cities and towns.
That helps. Thank you. We have a lot of great questions. Trying to grab another one, Mandy, if you have one ready.
Yeah, sure. So actually, this is my question. How do you determine the difference, and you mentioned this earlier in the presentation, the locational preference. How do you determine the difference between locational preference and economic necessity? So for instance, for a long time, people thought that millennials just didn't want to buy homes because they weren't buying single family homes. But when you consider the debt load from student loans, the lack of available housing options, et cetera, yeah, just a question about that.
It's a really good question, and they're really hard to unravel. And I do tend to say propensity more than preference, or I try to. Of course, I kind of use those terms interchangeably. But to be fair, it probably is propensity more than preference. So we absolutely are going to have, some of these lifestyle clusters are going to choose to be renters because that's what they can afford. They may not be able to afford to buy a house. I know just from studying these clusters, 71 of them, for the past 10 years, I do understand that some of them also have preferences, especially the upwardly mobile, up and coming young professionals. So they are, even when they could buy a house, we know that they're a market rate and above. They're very upwardly mobile, career driven. They just really don't want to worry about maintaining a home and a yard and everything that comes with that. They like being mobile and footloose and free. So understanding that each cluster, some of them are unfortunately stuck, on the lowest income brackets. Many of them just are where they are because they're stuck and they really do need help. And on the highest income bracket, the homeowners living in, mansion style houses, we know that they're making preferences. And in the middle, they kind of get smashed together. It's like, well, are they choosing because, and we've even gone so far as to argue that, some millennials are trying to find a way to make it cool to not have a car. It's like, well, I don't need a car. I can get everywhere I need on my bike and that makes me super cool. I'm a trendsetter. But the reality might be that they're just getting by without a car. So it's a good question. It's tough to unravel, but we do acknowledge it.
Well, I just wanted to, Jane asked a question, and Jane, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, and this goes back to your first question, and just want to make sure that Sharon answered it. You said doesn't available units influence what people are looking for in housing format?
Absolutely, it absolutely does. So that's that catch-22. And that's why when I look at a place like Lewiston, I want to look at also all of its neighbors and make sure that we're understanding whether lifestyle clusters are perhaps bypassing Lewiston. And if that is the case, we can we can do a study of what's currently on offer or available in Lewiston and figure out, is it possible that those lifestyle clusters are bypassing that city because they're just not finding what they might be looking for. So that's what we call the upside, or kind of a boost, is when I run the mathematics, when I run the model, I have to make that judgment about whether I think a community could do a better job of intercepting households that are going to other places. That's a big part of the TMA model.
There's another question here from Liz Trice. What is the income range for striving singles?
Good question. So the striving, well, it's going to vary by place, but I would say probably higher than 35. I would probably put it closer to 45 to 65.
Okay. Another question related to income. How does a two-person wage earner family figure in? For instance, when one or both of the couples are digital dependents, which is counted? Is the classification based on the highest income person? And this question is from Jane.
It's based on the head of householder. So it would be based on whoever reports themselves as the head of household, which often gets integrated into our tax returns and how we respond to surveys when we do respond.
And a related question I had when we were looking at the differences in your number categories, with the 70s are higher income, correct?
Yeah. Yes. No, the other way. 71 is the poorest and 1 is the richest.
Okay, then you answered my question.
That's okay.
Anne mentions Lewiston and Portland are walkable and have public transportation, whereas that infrastructure in Topsom isn't as robust. How does that factor in?
I think it does factor. I have to say I'm such a proponent for placemaking, whatever that means for each community. And placemaking ties in with transit, it ties in with recreation and entertainment and places to dine. Really, many of these migrating target markets are looking for communities where they can feel socially connected. That's just really key. And whatever that means for your community, how to help your residents feel socially connected. It may be everything from town squares to transit to having a theater, to having eateries with outdoor seating, to having paths and trails, to really leverage those resources. And that is how you can compete. So I really am a big proponent of, communities really investing in those sorts of amenities so that you can effectively compete for households that might otherwise bypass you altogether.
Great. Ian asks if you controlled for colleges and student population as part of your data crunching.
So that's a really good question. There is one lifestyle cluster called colleges and cafes. They also include university and college faculty and staff and recent alumni. But that group also does show up in, let's see, I think it was Lewiston possibly. Forgive me for not knowing your communities as well as you do, but I know that colleges and cafes did show up in one of the places, and it didn't quite make the list in terms of the top 12 most prevalent lifestyle clusters. So if you recall on my slideshow, I had basically was just showing 12 lifestyle clusters in each place, and it just barely made the cut. So it didn't show up on those graphs, but I do know that it's there. And I've done studies in a number of college towns where we have actually pulled that group out and actually done a special study on that group. So they're very important, and because students have such high movership rates, they really can inflate. They can seem to actually inflate the market potential. And so we want to be really careful and cognizant of that and cautious and even do a, kind of a study within a study of that special group.
Great. Bill Mann, you asked, can you comment on the demographics of the groups and communities? Do you feel like you've gotten what you needed from Sharon on that already?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say about the college towns. I mean, that my question was because every single one of those groups, Topsom with Bowdoin, Lewiston with Bates, Southern Maine, University of Southern Maine in Portland. It seems like a large population group for cities this size, but all in that there, I don't know what, it seems like it could drastically skew the results.
Yeah, let me check my data. I actually have my data right here. Let me check it. If you'll bear with me while I find it. Colleges and cafes, they're number 53 in the list. And on Topsom, they don't show up there. And then on Lewiston, I have 90 moving into Lewiston each year that are brand new. They're not moving within. So there's also a group that would be moving within, so they're there, they're staying for 4 years or 2 years. They might be just shuffling from one house to another house or from the dorms to another location. So that 90 does not pick them up. It's just the new. And then here's Portland. I had 59. So I would have to go into, the one piece that I didn't talk about is the layer of analysis that studies households that are already living within these communities that are also on the move. So in addition to brand new households migrating in, we have a whole nother data set of households that are already there that are just moving from one address to another. And that's an important group to look at, particularly when we're working with developers on understanding things like rehabs and remodels and figuring out whether, particularly student behavior. So I hope that helps a little.
And just to clarify, if students are in a dorm, are you counting them in this or no?
If I run the data on populations, I can pick them up. If I run the data on households, they don't show up. So for some, depending on each college and university, how they report their data to the United States Census, it's kind of weird, but it's a strange one. I've had entire dormitories get listed as, one unit. And I've had other dormitories in the same college get listed as 200 units.
Yeah.
So the only way that I can, so looking at it that way, in terms of households, households. So the way that I can pick the data up is to just look at populations, which is a separate, again, it's another layer to the analysis.
Okay. A couple more questions, just, I think we might have gotten these, but the question is, the availability of housing stock type has to do a lot with what folks are looking for, correct? And then another similar question, I'm confused about looking for houses or looking for duplexes. Is this measured by what they find?
No, it's measured. So what they're looking for, their propensity to choose a house versus a duplex, is based on their nationwide average behavior. So it's not based on what they're actually choosing in Lewiston. It's based on what they're actually choosing across the nation as a national average. And
Right.
could you ask the first part of the question again?
The availability of housing stock type has a lot to do with what folks are looking for, correct?
Not, so the availability of housing stock by type influences what people are looking for? No, because the propensity for them to look for different building types is based on nationwide averages. And the idea is that when you look at a geography so large as the United States, that the data starts to really become so valuable. You could argue that, you could theoretically argue that if the lowest income households nationwide are all choosing low rent apartments, is that because that's the only thing available? I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with the question. So I guess the simplest answer is that's not quite right. And perhaps I would say that actually we know, let me try it this way. If I know that nationwide the striving singles, 30% would choose an urban loft. If they're looking for urban lofts, if I have 50 of those striving singles in Lewiston, then they've settled for something else. And I also know that maybe the other half of them would settle for something else. So it's kind of, the challenge is to actually match up their inclination to choose different building formats with what's actually built in the market, and then to deduce whether you actually have an undersupply of what they're looking for, and therefore you're not doing such a good job of intercepting those households. I realize that was a circular answer. So perhaps that person could just give me a call and I could try to do a better job explaining it for you over the phone. Thanks for your patience.
That's great. No, I
Let's
think
try another one. I didn't answer that well, but that's okay.
The question is, how to develop using this info while not contributing to raising overall rent, contributing to displacement of low income renters. So how do you develop using this information while not contributing to
absolutely. Yeah. So one thing I really caution developers is that they shouldn't be using this data to just go after the striving singles and kind of ignore all the other lifestyle clusters. We really need to make sure that we're understanding who's migrating into and within the region, and then work with developers to provide a diversity of housing prices across a diversity of building formats and unit sizes that will meet the needs across the full spectrum. So that is absolutely a challenge. I work with many communities that I have some communities that are so affluent that they don't have any affordable housing choices for workers. So workers supporting the businesses can't even afford to work in the community. And some of those communities have internal policies. Some are being very proactive to try to provide more affordable housing choices and formats. And other communities are, hey, this is great. We're happy for the upscale luxury lofts and townhouses. Let's just build more. And I'm watching those kinds of stories to see, you know, usually there's a paradigm shift at some point where the leadership changes and they realize that they've gotten themselves stuck and that they missed the opportunity to diversify. So diversity is very important.
Great. Milan asked a question, do we have a sense of, you know, how these different categories transition as they, I think, increase in their income? What typology do you typically evolve into as your household makes more money, or as you go through various shifts like marriage, children, etc.?
Yeah, so with 71 lifestyle clusters, I have not tried personally to track over time, like over 10 or 20 years, how each cluster evolves. But I will share that Experian does reshape the data every couple of years, which is really, you know, helpful information for me. Sometimes it's maddening because they'll actually, not only will they update the data 4 times a year for the existing lifestyle clusters, but every couple of years they go in and they just reclassify all of them because everybody's changed. We've all moved forward in time. And so it's fascinating to see how the new clusters evolve, but I don't really try to track which cluster. There's no way for me to just definitively say this cluster moved up into that cluster and that cluster moved over to that cluster. It's more that individual households, you know, they say we all have 7 lives. You know, at one point we're a child and then we're a college student, perhaps. We're a worker, we're a parent, we're a spouse, we're a parent, we're a grandparent, we may be single, we may be married, and there's so much happening among different people making all these different lifestyle changes. They will usually, with their lifestyle change, end up migrating to a certain block group or end up at a block group, and they get blended in with the lifestyle propensities of all the other households that live with them in that same block group. So it kind of becomes a blend, and that's why it's the great melting pot. We call it the mosaic. So the data does move with time, but it's really tough to track who goes where. It's not that simple.
Okay. Shout out to past Build Maine speaker Allison Quinlan, who says Bernice for president. For that, I laughed out loud a second ago. Liz asks, what's the income rate? Why are singles moving so much in Portland? I think we already got what their income range is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I often talk about this with my clients and my stakeholders. And in fact, Jim Tischler and I have even talked about it and brought this up many times. What are the motivators for motivating movership? And it varies. It's going to vary for each lifestyle cluster. But the motivations of moving are also really, really diverse. So at the lowest income, I think at the lowest income, we're going to have some real pressures on our renters. It's going to be driven by their ability to pay. So when the landlord, if you imagine being a low income renter, if the landlord increases the rent, or if your car that you rely on to get to work suddenly stops working, or if your mother who's living with you, who's ailing, becomes sick, you know, all of these things can motivate these life changes. We may find that we have to move closer to public transit, or get our child closer to school so they can walk to school safely, or get your mother closer to a hospital so that she can get care more easily. There are lots of motivators like that. Income is definitely, as you move up the income, as when there's 2 wage earners in a household and they're both affluent, their inclination to buy a house and to buy a home really goes up, you know, exponentially. So there definitely is a correlation between income and rent, but we really want to challenge the notion that low-income households rent apartments and rich households buy houses, because we're finding that more and more renters are renting houses, and even affluent households are choosing to rent a townhouse or a loft, or also choosing not to own a house. So really challenge those notions that are kind of reinforced by the conventional supply-demand analysis. I hope that helps.
Great. Claudia asks, is the data for Auburn likely similar to Lewiston? How about Brunswick, similar to Topsom? And I think, as you know, those are communities that are across the river from each other.
I'm not sure. You guys would know better, actually. I don't know if there's anyone in the audience that could pitch in on that. I will be honest and say that this was the work that I did for this presentation was a 2-day, really quick analysis, and usually I'll spend 30 days working on a market study. And I did these 3 places in 2 days, and I did not, unfortunately, have the luxury of time of really diving into the personalities and the identities and the culture and what makes each place unique, and your relationship with the communities, with your sister cities. So I don't know if anyone else would like to pitch in on that.
I think I'm from Topsom, Andrew Deasy. I think from my perspective, yeah, the market area is greater than just the jurisdiction of Topsom. And our community shares the assets of Brunswick's downtown in a lot of ways. Our housing stock is completely different in its diversity than Brunswick's in a lot of ways. So really kind of analyzing it at a larger perspective, I think, would be a better look.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. I worked with Kara to identify 3 places that were jurisdictions that we thought would be interesting. And I agree with you. If I were doing this study for Topsom or for Lewiston, I would absolutely not just do one community in a bubble like that or in a silo. We really would need to look at both communities and the primary county, as well as compare them with neighboring communities.
Great. Jim Tischler offers an enlightening anecdote. He says, if one wants to buy kale, but the store only stocks peppers and tomatoes, the choice is to be stuck with peppers or tomatoes, or leave to find another store which might stock kale. So I think that helps sort of describe what you're talking about here. Doug,
right? He's saying if you don't offer the building formats that these lifestyle clusters are looking for, then they will go to another community.
Yeah. Doug from Lewiston says, for Lewiston, it's just as important to plan and offer desired housing types as it is to expand community amenities like a connected trail, park system, or entertainment and arts district, etc. ? Sorry, I should have asked that as a question. Is it important?
I'm sorry, could you actually ask the question again?
Yeah, is it just as important to plan and offer desired housing types as it is to expand community amenities like trails, parks, entertainment, arts?
Absolutely, without a doubt. So they go hand in hand, and we could, invest a lot of, resources and money and into amenities and recreation and attractions and placemaking. But with that, we're building the foundation to support bringing in missing middle housing formats. So that really is, intended to support new building formats. So if we stop there, hopefully we're not stopping there. The next step is to work with local developers, pre-qualify your developers in your development community, identify projects, identify sites, and work in a collaborative kind of public-private partnership kind of way to make real projects happen. And so that's the work that I get involved with like the Incremental Development Alliance, and individually working with my developer clients is ultimately my my goal is not to just generate market studies that inform your master planning process and give you data. My goal is to give you the resources and inform a process of actually working with developers to make real projects happen in your communities in ways that generate economic growth. That's my real goal.
Thank you. I think this is a really great question from Justin Barker. He asks, and I think you touched on this at the very beginning, but do outmigration and inter-community movement data not play a significant role? Or is in-migration the true indicator of supply demand for housing type based on these lifestyle clusters?
So I think internal migration is probably the most important, because if we have a lot of movement in a market, I will say, you know, I can measure the actual migration inside any given city. And we have that data from how tax forms are filed, how households file their taxes. And that really is critical for understanding if there's a lot of movement among renters, then that tells me they're unsettled. There's something going on that's motivating that high movership, and we want to figure out where the challenge might be. It may be that there's a surplus of choices, so moving is just very, very easy. It may be that they're not finding what they're looking for, so they're constantly searching. The outmigration, the reason why we leave outmigration behind is that I always have this concern that if we take in-migration of 100 folks and then we adjust for out-migration of 120 folks, we might find that we have a net out-migration of 20. And if I report that to communities, they will actually say, why should we build anything? We're losing population, we're losing households. That is exactly the kind of thinking that gets us stuck, that gets communities in a position where they're struggling to really even imagine building anything new. So the target market analysis is intended to give them the encouragement to demonstrate that, look, you have 100 new households moving into your city each year. Let's figure out what building formats they want. Let's build more of that, especially if it's missing. And we can actually reverse this net out migration trend and get you back on path and back on track with growth. So it's a philosophical approach.
That makes sense. Let's see. In the internally mobile group, is there data on older adults, the downsizers? What is the market potential for retirees to age in community downtown?
Yes, so several of the lifestyle clusters, I'm going to glance down here a little bit because I want to read them off of my long sheet here of 71. This is part of my model, and this is that's for Topsom. I think that would be a good one to look at. So some of the lifestyle clusters in here that really show up on our older citizens. C11, so number 11 on the list, aging of Aquarius. Number 12, golf carts and gourmets. 13, silver sophisticates. And I'm going to keep going. Let's see. There's lots of families in here, lots of singles, lots of recreation, fun. Number 34, aging in place. And I'm going to continue a little bit more. Bear with me because I know they're in here. And we have town elders at 64. So these are small town elders and leaders. And one more here, which is the senior discounts, also called senior towers. So if you have a high-rise senior tower, that's number 65 in the list. They don't show up a lot. They don't show up as much as stakeholders expect because, you know, there's so much coverage out there right now, media coverage about this trend that seniors are looking to downsize and they want to move it out of a detached house into a townhome or a patio home, and that there's this big market potential and unmet need for that. The reality is that this age group is a much smaller share of the total households in every community. And the fact that there's fewer of them and the fact that they're older actually means that they're quite settled. So we're finding that over time, like the aging in place even, only 3% of them move each year. That's a really low movership rate. And because they're in the older cohort, there is also far fewer of them. So collectively, they don't generate this big number that communities often expect. They are there, but they're there in much smaller numbers than what mainstream media would have us believe. So seniors tend to be settled. They tend to have fixed income, and they tend to be a much smaller group, which means they don't show up as much as we expect in the data. Age in place housing is really intended, in my mind, for communities that we help our seniors live in their existing home and in their existing house as long as possible to live out the days of their lives if they want. And I really struggle with this notion that we should somehow be even motivating, if not encouraging, our aging parents to downsize and move out of their homes. If they really just want to continue living in their home, we should instead be trying to find the resources that they need to make that possible. And this is something, it's not only important today, but it's going to be increasingly important over time as we realize we have a surplus of houses, and we have, just really making sure that we're keeping owners in those homes and letting them enjoy their home through their life cycle and until the end of their lives, if that is in fact what they want.
Great. Just a quick question from Ian. What year is this data that you presented?
So this data was year-end 2019, and it does get updated every 4 times a year, but I had actually run the data at the end in the first quarter of this year, and then it went into my folder, so I didn't rerun it.
Yeah.
But right now we would have January, February, March. We would have first quarter 2020 data available right now if I reran it.
Yeah, great. Abigail asks, how do you encourage housing diversity and development? Jim responds, run a TMA as part of your comp plan work and let it drive future use designations, development regulations. And Abigail says, I was thinking from a financial perspective, there's not necessarily the right incentives for developments to build diversified housing if it's more profitable for them to build something else.
So that's a really good question. I work often with developer clients on helping them understand that relationship between rent per square foot and unit size. And so many of the clients that come to me anyhow have this notion that to offset the cost of their project, they need to have super rents. They need to have high rents, $1,200 a month, $1,400 a month. That's the only way my pro forma will work. And so when I start showing them the data demonstrating that the households that are inclined to look for that product type or that building format type have lower incomes. And in fact, those lower incomes are going to support lower rents, that what we need to do then is right size the units. And they do tend to resist that because when you decrease the unit sizes, you're talking about putting more units into the same floor area, the same footprint. So instead of taking that loft building and having 10 units on each level, you now are going to squeeze in 12 or 14. And they're imagining now I have to build 12 or 14 kitchens instead of just 10. But what they're missing is that the rent per square foot is going to give that back to them, and they're going to do better on the absorption rates and better on the profit if they have smaller units that are appealing to a larger number of households that have that need. So being careful that the developers don't overprice the units because they think that's how their pro forma needs to work, and overpricing to the point that it overshoots the market And the market rate households, market rate incomes can't even pay that kind of a rent. And then they end up with expensive units, oversized luxury units that they have a hard time moving, and they just don't have the absorption they expected. So always lower priced units and smaller units will have the best absorption rates.
Great. A question from Jasmine. Have you noticed ways that COVID-19 have changed housing demand? Are there significant changes that have happened or anticipated changes?
I'm hearing a lot of things out there right now, everything from millennials with expensive apartments, sharing apartments in downtown San Francisco, you know, abandoning their rents and moving back in with mom and dad in suburbia, and real fear about that kind of dialogue, that the media is kind of fanning that dialogue right now, and questions about whether there's going to be flight from our urban city cores out to suburbia and whether this is going to contribute to sprawl. These are all very valid questions, but we're trying really to imagine the inverse, which is that young professionals today, and including teenagers, for those of us who have teenagers at home, watching their parents go through this, being furloughed or losing a job and struggling to pay rent or a mortgage. These are formative years, and these teenagers and young adults as well are going to carry this with them as they choose where to live and where to work. I actually think there's going to be an upturn in opportunities for mid and small sized cities like Lewiston, where, you know, these young migrating urbanites will perhaps be looking for affordable places to live, but they will also still be inclined to be renters. They'll be looking to rent lofts, and they will want to have home-based businesses. So to be an entrepreneur, to be in charge of my own future and my own economic resiliency, to not be dependent on a boss who could, you know, let me go when there's an economic downturn. If I can be my own proprietor and run a business out of my home, that starts to shape the way that we plan and design our downtowns and our urban places, and making sure that we're offering the resources that, if you can imagine single renters in your urban places running home-based businesses, feeling isolated and wanting to get out of their unit so that they can hold a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with someone in a public realm, and really thinking about what does that mean for work share, for what they call, you know, kind of hot office spaces, for flex workspace, and for amenities in our downtowns that will appeal to these young entrepreneurs. So I'm going to be watching these trends as much as you, and very curious to see how this will unfold over the next 24 months.
Kenneth says, remember when there were 3 or more generations in the same household? I don't know if that plays into your data at all.
Well, I think it does. So many communities, you know, there's a real interest now for mature singles to be able to care for an ailing older parent. And for boomerang kids, you know, the kids that go to college, graduate, or struggle because they lost their job, for them to kind of boomerang back home and move into the basement or whatever. These are great strategies for using our, you know, oversized houses that used to be designed for mom and dad and 2.2 kids. You know, that family unit has really changed so much. And I think it's smart to keep our eye on recognizing the diversity and the way that family compositions are changing over time, and they will continue to change.
Another sort of specific question about household types. Is there a trend related to people who own multiple homes, for instance, a single family home and a condo?
That's a really good question. I'm not, you know, I just had a conversation about this very question yesterday with one of my clients on what the impact might be on a lake community. And Jim, you probably know which community, the Canadian Lakes community. This question of whether COVID-19 is going to really have a negative impact on second home ownership and for you know, Chicagoans who might own a second home in a lake community. And it's really a tough question, but it can also lead to this idea that homeowners could also maybe becoming accustomed to, and even some of them growing to like the idea of running a home-based business. So I could be semi-retired and move to Canadian Lakes in Michigan and actually decide that I'm going to start a second career with a small home-based business out of my home. So it actually, for some communities, it might enable us to compete with larger cities, this notion of being able to work from home and this notion of not being dependent on being in the city core. So I think these are all going to be pushes and pulls. I think the important thing to remember is that for every trend that pushes the data in one direction, there's another trend that pulls it back. And it's really to really be cautious about saying it's going to be all or nothing, to not assume that urban, you know, our urban cities, our urban cores are going to become desolate and everyone's going to flee to suburbia, because it's never that simple. There's going to be many variables that will pull them back into our cities just as much as motivate some to flee.
Great. Robert says, as a renter for 8 years in Portland and as a current landlord, most moves prompted by lifestyle changes, relationship changes, job changes, and even social changes. All of these things can happen each year for renters. And Jim chimes in that all research says that both preference and costs are critical, and that lack of preference inflates movership. I think that means preference availability.
Absolutely. If you can't find what you are looking for, you may be very inclined to move again the next year. So I may be offered an awesome job in Lewiston, and I'll take it, and I might rent a house to get me by a year. And if I'm really struggling to find what I really want, which is that cool, trendy loft in the downtown, if I just can't find it, when that other job opportunity comes to bring me back to Michigan, I might, you know, it's going to be a factor in my decision of whether I stay.
Yeah, and Mary H., I don't know if you're still on the line, but she says, if I need to relocate and I can't find what I want and settle on something else, I'm planning my next move as soon as I move in. So I think that's kind of getting at that point.
I think there's going to be a lot of movership after COVID-19 because we've had so much shakeout with jobs. It's unfortunate, but some employers are going to use this as an opportunity to, you know, to downsize or, you know, shed off workers that maybe hadn't been quite the right fit. And we're going to have a lot of unemployed workers on the move. And that's a trend I think we should watch for. Sorry to cut you off, Kara.
Oh, no, you didn't. I think we're at the end of, we just had one more question come in, but sure. I would say at this point, if anyone wants to unmute themselves, I'm going to read this one last question, but if anyone wants to jump in after that with any additional questions, that's great. Kenneth asks, how do you define affordable housing?
So we can follow the HUD definition, which says renters should only pay 30% of their income on rent. And maybe owners should only spend 40% of their income on a mortgage. So that would be like there is a very much a HUD established definition of what's affordable. And they will go so far as to say, here's the area median income is $45,000. And if households are earning only 80% of that, then they're low income. If they're earning 50% of that, then they're very low income. And if they're only earning 30% of that, then they're extremely low income. So they get quite detailed. The data is kind of murky. Their methodology of deciding what the area median income is and establishing that for a county or for a region is not crystal clear to everybody, so it's kind of murky. I tend to talk more in terms of price attainability and price tolerance, which is a little higher than saying, you know, whether it's affordable by HUD standard. So price attainability, you might argue, well, if it's attainable, if I can, maybe I'll tolerate spending 35% of my income on that rent. It's still attainable for me. And in some markets like Portland, where the rents are exceptionally high, where is the tolerance? It's like, boy, this really isn't attainable for me, but maybe I'll tolerate it for a little while. So all of those definitions are kind of loose, but I don't think we only have to talk about affordable housing. We could talk about whether things are attainably priced and whether migrating households have a tolerance for those prices.
Great. If anyone has any questions, jump in. I just wanted to also give a shout out to Cade Benfield, who is going to be speaking in a couple weeks. He's been on the line, and we're excited to hear him talk about climate change as it relates to land use. So stay tuned for that. Does anyone?
Well, thank you everyone for the chance to talk and to talk with you today and to hear your questions. You've asked so many really tough, good questions, and I'm grateful for that. So I appreciate having a chance to have a voice here at the Build Maine conference.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. If anybody has any last minute questions or would like to hang on the line and chat a little bit, please feel free. But if not, we will be sending around a follow-up email with video links, hopefully within a week. And stay tuned. You will receive next week's Zoom links on the morning of the event. So keep signing up, folks, and we hope to see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.